And this has been a really fun series. I like going through something like a familiar passage like 1 Corinthians 13, because when you do, you discover a lot of different things that you didn't know before. And as the guy that's working on this and putting together sermons and messages and things like that, I'm always astounded at what I learn from it, and I always find myself a lot convicted. Okay, and sometimes I wish I didn't have to do it, because when I get done, I always find myself going, oh man, I thought I understood this, I thought I had this figured out, but then I feel like I got a million miles to go. But I think we're all in this together, and so we're going to continue on and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to pick up with verse 6, but just as point of review, we're going to start back at verse 4 where we started the whole thing off, just to kind of review what we were talking about and kind of see that a little bit and see the ground that we've traveled these past couple of weeks as we're looking at what love is. And today we're looking at what pure love is and what that looks like in our lives and as it's played out. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. It says this: love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. And where we pick up today in verse 6, it says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Let me read that again. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. As we look at that, I'm looking forward to seeing what Paul is trying to communicate here through this and communicate to us through his word and what that pure love looks like and what that looks like all played out in our lives. This summer, athletes from around the world are going to be traveling to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the 2016 Olympic Games. And when most people think of Rio, they think of this. They think of images that look like that. I think I got another one up there that's also pretty attractive to look at, and we'll see. We think of beautiful things. We think of a place that is neat to look at. We think of some place that we would want to take our sweetie on vacation if we could. We'd say, this is some place that we want to go. Yeah, that looks really good. The bird's eye view, the postcard picture is wonderful. And it's someplace that looks really, really exciting. It looks like some place to be. But for some of the athletes that are competing in the games, they have a little trepidation. They're not real happy about going to Rio. Now, for some of the athletes, they're fine with the whole thing. But some of the other athletes, if you've heard some of the news stories, they're not super thrilled. And the athletes that aren't super thrilled are the ones that actually have to get into the water, because the water there doesn't look quite like it does in the picture there. From a bird's eye view, it looks pretty good. But when you get closer, you find it looks a little more like this. Rio is known, and there's another picture, Rio is known for dumping their city sewage into the water. Even the parts that don't look good, or even the parts that look good, that look like, okay, that'd be okay, they're full of microbes and bacteria and things like that. Have you ever heard of flesh-eating bacteria? Yeah, that stuff. It's the stuff that, nobody wants to go in there. Nobody wants to swim in that, and it's got to be kind of a heated issue. They promised everybody that it would be fixed. They reassured everybody that it was going to be fine. It was going to be no problem. But it's still a little bit of a problem. It's an interesting thing because Rio looks beautiful, doesn't it? It looks like a great place to go, and you look at it and you think, that would be awesome. That's a place I want to spend time. That's a place where I'd like to spend my hard-earned dollars to travel. Those athletes are lucky. But once we look a little bit further, we find that it's not as pure as it first appeared. It doesn't look like the postcard that it did before. As followers of Christ, we can fall into the same trap of having lives that look pretty good from a distance, pretty good to the outward eye, to the outward appearance. But when we get a little bit closer, we begin to see a lot of defects, a lot of pollution, so to speak, that's in our lives, a lot of things that we put there, a lot of things that we're hiding there from public consumption, but are there nonetheless. This is what we're talking about today, and Paul is talking about this. We can fall into a trap and believe, hey, we've got it all figured out. We're okay. The average person will look at my life and say, Matt looks like a pretty good guy. Until they get below the surface, until they look a little bit closer and they say, you know what? He's got some things there. He's got a ways to go. It's not exactly how it looks. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at today. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about, that Paul is talking about with the church at Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 13:6, Paul instructs the Christians that we must live lives in a way that honor God with a love that is pure. A love that is pure in all that we do. We have to communicate this pure love, this pureness and holiness in our lives. And that's what Paul is talking about. That's what he's trying to communicate. And as we look a little further, if we look at 1 Corinthians 13:6, we see the first part of the verse. The first half of this verse, Paul says this. He says, love does not delight in evil. Love does not delight in evil. It's really simple. But if we look further between the surface, we can see exactly what it is that he's talking about, because you have to understand the backstory. You have to understand what Corinth was in its day, what it looked like, in order to understand what he's talking about here and understand what it means. The city of Corinth at the time of Paul was the most beautiful, modern, industrious city in Greece. It looked great. It looked like a place that anybody would want to visit, anybody would want to be a part of. It was a hub of activity, a hub of influence. It was a place to see and to be seen. This was a place that you would want to go. But the large number of people and from different and diverse backgrounds that were brought into this place, it brought with them a lot of influences. And with that came a really strong dark side. A really strong dark presence in the city of Corinth. And this was a problem. And this was a huge problem in Paul's day. You see, the cult gods that were there of the time, Greece, Rome, and Egypt, they were the norm. Now, if we talk in this day about cult gods, and especially in Council Bluffs, Iowa, we don't see a lot of cult temples set up around our city for the most part. We don't see that, So it seems kind of foreign to us. But at that time, this was commonplace. This was like seeing another church on the corner. This was like seeing another place just to go and worship. This is what this appeared to be. And this was a huge problem. As a matter of fact, before Paul's time, there had actually been a temple to the goddess Aphrodite that stood on the summit of Corinth and overlooked the city. And in that belief, there was like 1,000 of temple prostitutes that were there. And this was a practice that continued on. It actually had moved its way down into the city in Paul's time. The temple wasn't there anymore, but people that worship Aphrodite were. And they were still engaging in those practices and those beliefs. And this was a common thing. This was something that people knew, they understand, and it was just something that you just kind of lived with. It was just kind of there. There were temples of all different beliefs. And quite honestly, it was very confusing, and people got distracted at times, and they lost their focus on what it was that was most important, and they lost their focus on who they were. Because the church at Corinth sometimes were getting sucked back into their old ways. They said, I want to believe in Jesus, I want to follow Christ. But then they would come over here, and they would dabble in something that they used to do. They would dabble in some of these cultic practices, and Paul was saying to these guys, you can't do that. It doesn't work. You can't come in and serve Jesus Christ and do these things too. It's not acceptable. You can't live in both worlds. This place of Corinth, it was a rough place. It was a place that hosted many sailors and traveling salesmen. And it was known so much for its liberal atmosphere and unsavory practices. There was not a lot of pure love going on. Paul was attempting to communicate to the people there was a need for them to keep their lives pure and not fall back in to the practices of their old ways, not fall back into what they used to do. It was of utmost importance that they maintain lives that were pure. It's easy, you see, for people to get pulled back in. It's relatively easy for people to get sucked back into what they used to do. And Jesus knew that. He knew that they couldn't live a dualistic lifestyle. They couldn't live a life that was following Christ and then doing all these other things as well. He knew that. It was important that they didn't fall back into all the stuff that had brought them down, all the stuff that had distracted them. As believers, we have to watch our lives as well. It wasn't just the church at Corinth that can suffer from these ailments. It's us too. Right here, 2016, Council Bluffs, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska. It happens. We can get sucked back in just like that. 1 Timothy 4:16. For some of the kids that are here, the students that are here, we talked about this verse briefly a few weeks ago. 1 Timothy 4:16. Paul writes this. He says, watch your life and your doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. Paul is trying to instruct Timothy, make sure that what you're doing is consistent. Make sure what you're doing honors God. Because not only is this good for you, and not only does that help you in your relationship with God, but it's going to help others. Because you see, people look at us. People look at our lives. I know probably people don't believe that or think it's that really big of a deal. But people pay attention to you. They know where you go on Sunday morning. Contrary to popular belief, they know you're here. They know I'm here. And they also know when I leave this place and what I act like on Monday. They know that too. When on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday, they see all that other stuff too. And if those two pieces don't line up, and if those two pieces aren't consistent, it creates a problem. They see that and they don't see how it correlates. Why do I need to come to church? Why do I need Jesus when y'all just act like everybody else does anyway? So who cares? You act just like I do. You're no better than me. You don't have your life figured out any better than I do, and we don't. But we need to be doing our best to living a life that's pure, a life that's holy. How are we doing that? That's the first part of this that Paul's trying to communicate. Love does not delight in evil means we're not delighting in evil ourselves. We're not partaking. We're not being sucked in to all that stuff. We're not being sucked in to all the ways of the past. There's a second point, though. There's a dual edge to this that Paul's trying to communicate here and trying to get across. Not only do we not delight in evil, okay, but we also can't take pleasure in the fact that other people do too. And what I mean is, we have to be sure to avoid judgmental attitudes when people stumble, when they mess up. We can't be constantly looking at ways that people are going to fall and that people are going to fail. We have to help people in this pattern. We have to help people and encourage them in their faith. It's easy to sit back and be a spectator. I'm a spectator sometimes. It's easy to watch and see things that are only going to lead to heartache, only going to lead to trouble. And we look at it and go, you know what? This is going to be a mess. I see it coming. I'm watching it happen. And we watch it and we're waiting for it to happen, but we don't really do anything about it. We're not doing anything very proactive. It made me think of something. Last weekend was the start of the NASCAR racing series. If anybody's into that, some people are, some people aren't. But it was the Daytona 500, which I guess they call the Super Bowl of auto racing. Here's a fun fact for you. I digress. Did you know the trophy for the Daytona 500 is made across the river in Omaha, right downtown? A couple years ago, we got to go over and I met the guy that made it. And his shop is just this dingy little place, and it's nothing special. And laying on the floor covered in dirt was the base for the Daytona 500 trophy for that year. So, of course, I picked it up, held it up, like, I'm the champion. It didn't have the little car on top of it, but I thought it was pretty cool. It's made right there. It was designed by a guy right there. It's amazing. Well, people watch racing for a variety of different reasons, and they get excited about it. They cheer on their favorite driver or their favorite car brand or a favorite sponsor and all that stuff. And they get excited, but you know what? There are a lot of people that have a whole different motivation. Some people don't really watch the race so much. They may tune into the highlights because you know what they want to see? They want to see the crashes. They want to see cars going 200 miles an hour, wheel to wheel. They want to see them wreck. And when they wreck, they're like, they wince and they say, ooh, but they keep looking because they want to see that happen, bouncing off one another, bouncing off the walls, careening down the backstretch. They love it. They don't want anybody to get hurt, but they sure like to see the wreck. They like to see the carnage, the mayhem. People watch for those kind of things. They want to see the carnage. You know what? The sad part is people do that with individuals in our lives. I've done that with individuals in my life. I sit back and I watch their lives and I say, man, they're out of control. They're traveling 200 plus miles an hour, and there is nowhere this is going to lead but a wreck. This is going to be a disaster. And I watch, and I wait, and I watch. And sure enough, something spins out of control, and they hit the wall. And then, with some kind of glib, weird satisfaction, you go, saw it coming. That's too bad. Saw it coming. And we shake our head and say, that's unfortunate. That's rough. But the question is, if we're loving people, we don't delight in this. Our hearts are broken by it. We're devastated by it. When we see people fall into these traps, fall into these pits, we're brokenhearted by it. The question is, do we stand in the gap for people? When you see people spinning out of control, are you on your knees? Am I on my knees? Are we praying for these people? Or do we just watch the carnage? Are we praying for them? The other question, are we doing anything to encourage them? I know some of us might be saying, I don't know what I can really do. I'm not really sure. But we don't do anything. And nothing is not a great option. It is an option. It is a choice, but it's not a really good option. Doing nothing is not a good option. Are we praying? Are we sending encouraging notes or emails to people? Are we inviting them to take part in activities with us that will encourage them and build them up and lift them up? Are we doing that kind of thing? Are we just watching? Are we just waiting for the wreck? If we're going to love like Christ does, we can't delight in evil ourselves, and we can't delight when others stumble and fail. We need to be there to encourage people and help pick them up when they crash and help them, hopefully, to avoid it. We need to do our very best with that. There's a second thing we learn from 1 Corinthians 13. The second half of the verse. First he says, love does not delight in evil. But then he goes on to say, but it rejoices with the truth. Love rejoices with the truth. The truth that Paul is writing about stands in direct contrast to the ways of the world. Paul understood what it was that believers in Corinth could see. He understood that. He knew that they were experiencing a lot of bad influence, a lot of stuff that wasn't good. He knew they were seeing that, but he was encouraging them, you know what? You guys need to be looking for what's true and what's right. Here it is. I'm laying it out for you. Look to Christ. Look to him for truth. The Christian life should be a stark contrast to what the world has put forth as our example. It should look different. It should look different. It should feel different. When we're living a life for God, it can't be exactly the same. Philippians 4:8, Paul, he sets a high example, a high standard for those things. Philippians 4:8. Paul says this, and this is a familiar passage. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on such things. So we've got to be looking. What am I filling myself with? Is it true? Is it noble? Is it right? Is it pure? Is it lovely? Is it admirable? Is it excellent? Is it praiseworthy? Is that the stuff I'm thinking about? Is that where I'm spending my time? If we're going to love as Jesus loves, we must love the things that Jesus would love. Make sense? If we're going to love like Jesus, we have to love stuff that Jesus would love and that fills us up and helps us become more like him. We must love what God's word tells us is true and right, not cheap copies. The world has a lot of cheap copies they put out there. It puts out there cheap copies of what a pure relationship looks like. And we've told people that you can have relationships with whoever you want, however you want, anytime you want. It compromises pure relationships when it comes to our finances or our pride or gossip. There's a lot of things the world says it's okay, just do what you want. But we know that that's not true. We know that that is not what Christ has centered us on, what Christ is focusing us on. We invest a significant amount of time sometimes and money into what we pour into our minds and into our lives. Books, movies, videos, places that we go online that nobody sees. What kind of stuff are we filling our life with? What are we pouring into ourselves? Because it shapes who we are, whether we like it or not. We can say it doesn't have an effect on me, but it does. Those things do have an effect on us. Those things do change us, shape us, and mold us. And it's so subtle, sometimes we don't even know it. Sometimes it's so subtle, we can't even feel it right up front. We have to ask ourselves, what is it? What is it that we're investing in? What do we love? Do we love the things that are true? Paul writes in Romans 12:9. He writes, love must be sincere. Here's what he says. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Two simple rules. Two things that are easy to remember. And I'm glad because I'm a pretty simple guy. I like simple stuff. Okay? Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Sometimes I get that a little messed up. Sometimes I like stuff I shouldn't like, and I don't hate it. I accept it. And I say, I give it a pass. And I don't know why. Because if my kids came home and did it, I wouldn't say it's okay. If my kids act like that, I wouldn't say it's fine. But for some reason, it's fine if somebody else is doing it. Or it's fine if I'm ingesting it another way through television or movies or music or whatever it is. I have to ask myself these questions. What are we inviting into our lives? Are we inviting what's true, pure, and holy? I have a story that I heard a long time ago that I'm going to read to you. I want to share it with you, and it's one that really challenged me at the time, and maybe you've heard it before. It's about a stranger that's invited into a home. It goes like this. It says, a few months before I was born, my dad met a stranger who was new to our small Tennessee town. From the beginning, Dad was fascinated with this enchanting newcomer and soon invited him to live with our family. The stranger was quickly accepted and was around to welcome me into the world a few months later. And as I grew up, I never questioned his place in our family. Mom taught me to love the Word of God. Dad taught me to obey it. But the stranger was our storyteller. He could weave the most fascinating tales, adventures, mysteries, comedies were daily conversations. He could hold our whole family spellbound for hours each evening. He was like a friend of the whole family. He took Dad, Bill, and me to our first Major League Baseball game. He was always encouraging us to see the movies that had come out. He even made arrangements to introduce us to several movie stars. The stranger was an incessant talker. Dad didn't seem to mind, but sometimes Mom would quietly get up while the rest of us were enthralled with one of his stories of faraway places and go to her room, read the Bible, pray. I wonder now if she ever prayed that the stranger would leave. You see, my dad ruled our household with a certain moral convictions, but this stranger never felt any real obligation to honor them. Profanity, for example, was not allowed in our house, not from us, from our friends or adults. Our longtime visitor, however, used occasional four-letter words that burned my ears and made Dad squirm. And to my knowledge, the stranger was never confronted. My dad was a teetotaler who didn't permit alcohol in his home, not even for cooking. But the stranger felt he needed exposure and enlightened us to other ways of life. He offered us beer and other alcoholic beverages often. He made cigarettes look tasty, cigars look manly, and pipes look distinguished. He talked freely, too much freely, about sex. His comments were sometimes blatant, sometimes suggestive, and generally embarrassing. I know now that my earliest concepts of the man-woman relationship were influenced by the stranger. As I look back, I believe it was by the grace of God that the stranger did not influence us more. Time after time, he opposed the values of my parents, yet he was seldom rebuked and never asked to leave. More than 30 years have passed since the stranger moved in with a young family on Morningside Drive. But if I were to walk into my parents' den today, you would still see him sitting there over in the corner, waiting for someone to listen to him, talk, and watch and draw his pictures. His name, we always called him TV. This was a powerful thing when I first heard it because I thought, man, and I winced a little bit, like, oh man, this is tough. This is tough. Things that we look at and say, that's not true, and that's not the thing that I want to put in my life. And like I said, stuff that we tell our kids if they came and acted that way, we'd say, you can't do that. We kind of endorse it in a way by taking it into our own lives and taking it into our own spirits. And it's challenging and it's hard because it's so pervasive and it's there. But Paul's telling us, love rejoices in what's true. We have to constantly be on the lookout for that. What is true? What are we pouring into our lives? Because it makes a difference and it makes an impact. The love Paul encourages the Christian to have is true. We must love in a way that honors God. Love in a way that is pure. We're coming to our time of decision, and we all have choices to make. We have to ask ourselves some questions. The first question is, are we loving what is pure and true? Are we pouring things into our lives that honor God? Are we delighting in evil? Are we delighting in things that are counter to what we say we believe? We have to ask ourselves that question. Are we rejoicing in the things that are true? Are we filling our life, filling our spirits, filling our soul with those kind of things? During this time of invitation, we invite you to come. If you have any decision to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, to accept Him as your one true love and the guide for your life, we invite you to come. If you've made a decision for Christ and are challenged and are struggling, we'd love to pray with you. That's what we're here for. Nobody has it all figured out. Nobody in this room has everything under control. We all struggle. We're all challenged. But we're here to encourage one another. So we invite you to come as we stand and sing.